Probably the biggest one I'll start with, and is the title we talked about is having like 5 lessons I've learned, and by far the biggest one is communication and the importance of communicating between the people in the mill and the nutritionists, and that comes out in a number of different ways. Nutritionists can sometimes make the life of the person in the feed mill very difficult, or make it easier based on some of the requests that they have, and so communication around areas such as if we're going to change ingredients in a diet, given the feed mill lead time to know understanding, what's going to happen, and can we use up the existing inventory, to make sure that we optimize the cost and the benefit for everybody in the system. To things like having that comfort level that the people on the procurement side in the mill, when they get an ingredient in that doesn't look right, that they can pick up the phone and talk to the nutritionist and say, okay, is there something we need to do different here? Or if things go wrong in the mill, that's probably the biggest reason that as a nutritionist, I want a good relationship. Is I want the people in the mill to be comfortable to tell me when something goes wrong, and so we can come up with a plan that's going to have the least negative impact on the production system.
Welcome everyone to today's episode on Feed Science Podcast. I am here with a very special guest. I'm with Dr. Mike Tokach. Dr. Tokach is a university distinguished professor of animal sciences and industry at Kansas State University. Dr. Tokach joined Kansas State in 1991 as swine nutrition research and extension specialist. Dr. Tokach is an author of more than 420 articles in scientific journals, 11 book chapters, and more than 1,000 extension and non-referred articles. Tokach received more than 22 million in research grants and gifts, and he has also been awarded 7 patents for his research and has given more than 350 invited lectures in national and international meetings. How are you doing, Dr. Tokach?
Great. How are you doing today?
I am doing good. It's really good to have you here. I have heard your name a lot because as you might be aware, Dr. Charles Stark was my advisor in North Carolina State, and I know that you work close together.
Yes. And Charles has told me a lot about you too, and I'm very pleased to be able to meet you.
Thank you. And I think, even though I gave like a small bio about yourself, can you tell us a little bit about, your background and how you get into, nutrition and feed processing?
Yes. For your audience, one of the biggest things they should probably understand is I am a swine nutritionist. And so a lot of my perspective and what I'm going to be talking about today comes from that background as a swine nutritionist. I get my master's and PhD in swine nutrition and then finished my PhD at University of Minnesota. And after I'd had my master's here at Kansas State University and did some feed processing work as part of that program. And then I got to know the grain science group at that time, and then was able to come back on faculty, and so would have overlapped with Keith Benke at that time in terms of working with him some on some of my projects, and then also got to know Charles while he was doing his PhD work and at the time, and so we were very fortunate to have the grain science department here at Kansas State University that as a nutritionist, we got more training than what a normal nutritionist received in terms of what was going on in the feed mill. Certainly, I'm nowhere near the expert of what yourself or Dr. Fahrenholtz or Dr. Stark in terms of understanding feed mills, but I do have a very high appreciation for what happens in the mill.
Excellent. And one of the things that you say is as you mentioned, I work a lot in processing, and you do a lot of nutrition with feed milling. And could you, tell us, what do you think are the big lessons, that you have learned throughout the year as a feed mill nutritionist?
Probably the biggest one I'll start with, and is the title we talked about is having like 5 lessons I've learned, and by far the biggest one is communication and the importance of communicating between the people in the mill and the nutritionists, and that comes out in a number of different ways. Nutritionists can sometimes make the life of the person in the feed mill very difficult, or make it easier based on some of the requests that they have. And so communication around areas such as if we're going to change ingredients in a diet, given the feed mill lead time to know understanding, what's going to happen, and can we use up the existing inventory, to make sure that we optimize the cost and the benefit for everybody in the system. To things like having that comfort level that the people on the procurement side in the mill, when they get an ingredient in that doesn't look right, that they can pick up the phone and talk to the nutritionist and say, okay, is there something we need to do different here? Or if things go wrong in the mill, that's probably the biggest reason that as a nutritionist, I want a good relationship, is I want the people in the mill to be comfortable to tell me when something goes wrong, and so we can come up with a plan that's going to have the least negative impact on the production system, and be able to utilize the whatever product was made that may not be up to specs. Obviously, the cost of ingredients today is very high, and we don't want to certainly don't want to discard anything that we don't have to. And I could give several examples there, and some of them that people in the mill sometimes don't think are a very big thing. But a great example for me is I had a mill call me that had ran out of salt, and they were wondering. So, well, we're going to continue making feed because salt isn't very important and it's such a small portion of the diet. I said, whoa, time out. We need to talk about this, because we've had the experiences that something as simple as salt, that's the least expensive ingredient that we put in the diet many times, has the biggest impact on feed intake of an animal, and a diet without salt, they simply do not want to eat it. And so it has a major repercussion on downstream performance. And so being able to talk through some of those things, versus other avenues, are much easier to handle. If they run out of a particular ingredient, we can substitute many times, but some of them we can't substitute quite as easily.
Excellent. You were mentioning salt, and with in poultry, for example, we pay a lot of attention on that too, because and as you're mentioning, that communication is super important, because let's say you got the opposite, right? And then the pigs or the chickens start consuming more water in the field. So that could be that either there was a mistake, or probably a turnhead didn't close correctly, and then now you got too much salt. So it's really interesting what you're talking about, like the importance of communications between nutrition, feed mills, and the live production people working on the field.
Yep. That's exactly right, and I think it ties into the communication, ties into the my second lesson that I think I've learned is you want to build that level of communication so you can trust, but you still want to verify. And I think anybody that's involved with filling out paperwork in feed mills and all the reports that you can get now certainly can understand this, but you do want to build up that level of trust and know that the people in the mill are trying to do their best to meet the specs and the right what you're trying to do as a nutritionist. But you still want to be able to verify and get into that mill and take a look at the ingredient bins and make sure the micro ingredients are in the right bins, and do they look correct, and does it look like there's not any problems there, and getting in the mill also helps you to determine where there's bottlenecks and where there's opportunities for you to help the mill increase their throughput and productivity, or to reduce the cost for you by getting in and seeing what's going on and where the difficulties arise. And as you know, every mill is a little different on where those issues are at, and so you can't just assume that every mill has the same bottlenecks.
Yeah. And I don't know, like just to give you like one of the things that happened to me once, and the verification is very important. I went to a mill one time, and they have some issues with the scales, and the scales basically couldn't do what the feed formulation was asking for, and then they were likely verifying that at the end of the day they were not losing too much corn or too much soybean meal or gaining. But also it's important to see where that soybean meal and that corn went to, right? It went to the right batch. So that verification is extremely important.
Yes, and there's some really strange things that can happen, and verification and validation is the only way you can really track them down over time. And there's lots of examples. I have one from a good friend, Wayne Cass, that told me about that, where that took a long time to figure out in a mill what was going on, and because the final diets weren't matching up exactly, but when you did the validation of the ingredient usage in the mill, it all was matching up pretty closely. And what they ended up finding out is that there was a hole between two bins that was exchanging ingredients back and forth, and it took a long time to get to the bottom of that one, but and it was an ingredient that was used more heavily, if I remember right. It was used more heavily in nursery diets, and so it was still being used in the right amount, but totally in the wrong diets.
Yeah.
But those things can happen, and that's why you wanna that good example is there's nothing that the feed mill was necessarily doing wrong there. It was just that it took a while to figure out that there was an equipment failure that needed to be found.
Yeah, and to do this, we really need to train the feed mill employees. What would be your advice about what kind of training or how often they need to get that training?
Well, it's a good question, I think for me I don't know if I know the right number of the hours or how often they need to do this, but I think it's really that communication on helping them understand that small changes in some ingredients can be very important in terms of being off on the specs, and helping them understand which ingredients that's important for and which ingredients, and a lot of that ties into the tolerances that are built into the batching software, and making sure that those tolerances are set correctly. That obviously for major ingredients, our grains and our soybean meal, we can stand a lot more wider variation in terms of what's added to the diet than we get into some of the micro ingredients. And so I think some of that is having the software set up correctly to help make sure that you don't have the person in the mill having to make too many of those decisions themselves. And I think it really comes down to then when do they override what the alarm is saying, and when is it okay to override an alarm, and when is it not okay, and that's probably the biggest thing is if they don't have the training and the education to do that, to make sure that their supervisor does, or that there's somebody that they can rely on to answer those questions for them. I think is a real big key.
Yeah, and I think. And this is something that I'm trying to promote too. Is like the feed mill employees should get some training in nutrition, because that's when they are gonna understand, what are the most critical ingredients or nutrients in during feed processing.
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's, you get into the micro ingredients, and we talked about salt, but the premixes and every one of these premixes is handled differently in terms of how they're put up and put together. And we have some of them, we have regulatory issues we need to deal with, and others we don't. And so you have, like, if selenium is in that trace mineral premix or in a VTM, versus if it's handled separately, is probably the biggest one that we run into. Is when it's in a VTM, then you have a very strict maximum amount of that VTM that can go into a diet, and helping the staff understand that in the mill, and the workers know that you can't have higher than that level, and versus when you have it outside the VTM, then the VTM doesn't have quite the same restrictions and concerns, other than a cost concern if you go too much in a diet.
That is true. Yeah. And what other lessons, would you share with us?
Well, the third one that I had down is understanding where the incentives lie for the people in the feed mill, and that can be either financial incentives or non-financial ones, and obviously the financial ones sometimes are easier to see. Like we talk about reducing particle size and have, for pigs, we want a much lower particle size now than what you want on poultry. And we also know that there's a cost to go into lower particle size, and there's headaches that come with it. And so helping understand the critical importance of it and monitoring it to make sure that we're hitting the goals of on the swine production side, because of the impact that it has on feed utilization and feed efficiency. That's just one example. Understanding batch sizes and diet phases and how that works into the feed mill. Some feed mills, if I add another diet phase, it's a huge headache for them. And in terms of handling another diet, and this is really particularly in mills that are pelleting all their diets, as compared to a mill that is producing mash feed. Sometimes reducing a number of phases doesn't save them anything because they're making the same size batches and filling the trucks the same way. And so understanding that taking out a diet from a toll mill that's doing mash feed may not save you anything, versus doing it in a large pellet mill complex may be quite a huge savings for the mill and for the people involved. And so that, the financial side of it. But then I said the non-financial, what are the pain in the rear things that the mill doesn't like or that are real time consuming, and that those are ones that if I put in an ingredient that's higher, too high of inclusion rate, that has to be handled in a hand ad or any kind of hand ad that I add to the formula, that they don't have enough microbins in the mill, or there's not set up to weigh it out very easily. Those kind of things, you have to understand as a nutritionist, if you make that difficult and you make it hard, you make more of an opportunity to have a mistake, more of an opportunity for to have somebody that gets tired of adding it and decides not to put it in all the diets. All those little things that can happen with hand ads, it's so much harder to find when an error occurs. And so another headache one I just thought about was the DDGS side. That in the Midwest we deal with an awful lot of DDGS in our corn, soybean meal based diets, and for us the DDGS sources that are the best for the pigs and the best for feed efficiency most of the time aren't the same sources that are the best for handling in the feed mill. And so that having that discussion and that conversation that yes, we understand that unloading DDGs is not always the easiest or the most fun part of being in a feed mill, but that some of these sources that are either have a little higher fat content or have more solubles in them may provide more value to us on the nutrition side, but they may provide more headaches on the feed mill side.
Yeah. And when you were talking about changing ingredients or adding small sizes, do you see any trends in feed mills between those ones that are using mash and pellets? How do those trends look like moving forward? Are you seeing more people moving to pelleting or not really?
It depends on the part of the world that you're in. Is what I would say is in the Midwest U.S. we still aren't seeing a huge drive towards pelleted diets. Now, we certainly have large mills here that have pellet capabilities, but what we end up getting feedback on is even the larger integrators that have done trials, and we can pick up the benefits of pelleting. We know that if we make a decent quality pellet that we can find those responses quite easily. But when we go out in the field and with the quality of pellets that we often get when we're dealing with a corn soy based diet and with higher throughputs, we lose a lot of the benefits. We're not able to find them quite as large. And so and it ties to the health status of the pig so much, is that if we have areas where we have a lot of PRRS or flu, and where pigs are going off feed for a variety of reasons, or if we have the wrong feed equipment in the barns or the wrong feeders in the barns, all those kind of things can contribute to ulcers and ulcer mortality in the barns. And so then sometimes those losses in mortality offset the gains that we see in feed efficiency and growth from the pellets. And so it's a much different answer that what we see in the Midwest U.S., where it's corn soy based, than what I see around the world, particularly in Europe, or even when you get outside the Midwest, as you get further to where you're located, and then you get on the coast, the ingredient prices are much more expensive, and so then the cost of the diet and the benefit and feed efficiency is a much higher return, and so you have all those things interacting with each other, and probably the other big one in the Midwest that slows down the adoption of pelleting is the toll mill systems. We've got an awful lot of toll mills, and that's been a very big benefit for us in the Midwest to keep our cost of storage and production lower. But that's probably one of the biggest changes that we're seeing right now going on, is that we're seeing some consolidation of those mills and some mothballing of older mills. And so the transportation is starting to get longer between the feed mill and some of the sites. And as that continues to consolidate, I do think that we're probably going to go see pelleting, as an example, become a bigger issue because of the advantages that you gain even in trucking and in feed efficiency, and how much less feed you have to truck to the farm when you move to a pelleted diet.
Yeah, and do you see any difference in grinding equipment? Because I remember that once I went to the Midwest and I saw only roller mills. So I don't know if all the feed mills in the Midwest use more roller mills compared like to my area where everyone use hammer mills.
Yes, it's totally different. You're exactly right. We are almost entirely roller mills in the Midwest, and most of them are 3-high roller mills, and the reason we've moved that direction, and again, it's a very much a corn dominated diet, and when we're handling it in a mash form, you need to have flowability, and so you want a consistent, uniform particle size for flowability, so we can take that particle size down to 500 or microns or less, and still get it to flow through the bins and through the augers on the farm, and so, but obviously, as you know, when you go to a pelleted diet, the hammer mill provides you some advantages because you create that distribution of particles that sometimes is better for pellet quality, and so you have those opposite targets that you're trying to shoot for. And roller mills, a long time ago, roller mills started becoming popular in the Midwest because of the reduced energy usage, and I think when we go to the smaller particle size, as you know, you don't see quite the same advantages in energy utilization, but the uniformity of the particle size is what's really driven us to having, I would say, 3-high roller mills is definitely the standard that you'd see in the majority of the mills in the Midwest.
Okay, and so it seems like at 500 microns would be like that optimum particle size where you can get like the benefits of feed efficiency and good flowability characteristics.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you have, we know that well, with nursery pigs, if we get it much finer than that, they don't want to eat it. They don't like powder. Baby pigs don't like the pelletability of powder very much. Finishing pigs, it doesn't influence them as much going to smaller particle size, and you can continue to get feed efficiency benefits on a mash diet going down to 300 microns, but you just can't handle it in many situations. And so that's a lot of the reason that some people go to pellets, is just so they can lower the particle size and still get it to flow.
Yeah, that is true. That is true, because I imagine that if you get like too fine, it's probably really hard to manage at the feeder level.
Yes, it becomes a very difficult issue to get it to flow out of a feeder if it's too fine, and we have it just you don't, and then the pig, and this is when we have the other part with the consistent particle sizes is it doesn't allow the pig to do much sorting, and that's the pig will be a very efficient sorter if you give them the opportunity, and so we want to run our feeders relatively tight so that they eat the feed and they don't sort in the pan, and especially with today's feed cost, we obviously don't want any wastage occurring in the pan, and so if you run them a little tighter, that also hurts you on the flow of getting that feed out of the back of the feeder, and so it becomes a job for the person in the barn to keep feed available to the pigs at all time.
And do you know, like, if mills are grinding other ingredients like soybean meal, or they are basically focusing on grinding corn?
Yes, it's only corn. Certainly the most of the U.S. we don't see the soybean meal and or the DDGs come in ground fine enough, and and they, we'll have a few mills that'll deal in other grains that they'll have to grind, and that's where you see the hammer mill advantage. Is certainly if you're bringing in wheat or barley or oats in any level, you almost have to have a hammer mill to handle some of those ingredients. But when most of these mills in the Corn Belt would be only grinding their corn. We've done research on grinding the soybean meal, and there are some improvements in amino acid digestibility. When you grind the soybean meal finer than what it comes out of the soy processor, but it's hard to pick up those advantages when we do growth studies to show them. It's there are 2 to 3% improvements in amino acid digestibility that we have a hard time translating into the on the research side into improved feed efficiency. But it is one that I as I think about soybean meal, it also varies on where in the country the soybean meal is being produced. The particle size for in Kansas here or in Minnesota is a little bit smaller on the soybean meal than what I see in Iowa. Iowa, the soybean meal, for whatever reason, their particle size is about 200 to 300 microns higher than what it is out of some of the other areas, and so there's probably be more benefit on grinding, like the soybean meal as an example, if you're starting with an 11 or 1200 micron soybean meal than if you're starting with a 700 to 800 micron soybean meal.
Yeah, and I see that like in poultry we don't grind soybean meal too, but I see like typically when you go outside of the U.S. you see like many companies that grind it to improve pellet quality, but in poultry, we don't want to grind it because, poultry really need those coarse, porridge
Yes.
for gizzard function and reverse peristalsis. But I was curious about like the pig side.
Yeah. Well, and that, those larger particles, that's actually been an interesting one that I've watched what you've been doing on the poultry side. And we probably need to do a little bit of research on that in pigs because we know that there's some benefits for the intestinal maturation and for the right bacteria to have certain a certain percentage of larger particles. The trouble is if we do very many of it all in the pig, we give up on too much of feed efficiency. We don't have the crop to grind it the way the chicken does.
That's true.
I think another lesson that I had down, my fourth one is understanding scales and batching in the mill. And that, as a nutritionist, that's an area that I think it's very important for a nutritionist to understand, and very important for the feed mill to help also communicate back to the nutritionist on what can be done. And just the examples I have there is we have an ingredient like tryptophan that we may formulate to 100th, and then the person at the feed mill enters it in the computer to the nearest 10th, and then we find out that their batching system is only measures to the nearest half a pound or to the nearest pound, and so we totally lose the precision and the benefit, and all of a sudden we've taken a relatively expensive micro ingredient and we are either not adding it at all, and we think we are, or we're adding it at a much higher rate than what we thought we were when we put the formula together.
Yeah, and that's something that, what I was telling you about this feed mill that have issues with inventory management, it was because there was no compatibility between what the formulation, like the formula that the feed mill receives and what the scale can actually do. And I think that is very important, and we forget about that.
Well, and that's when we've learned this the hard way a little bit on, and probably one of the very important areas that people have gotten themselves in trouble in the swine industry is around phytase and calcium and phosphorus, and a lot of this has been around how the equipment in the mill responds as compared to what the nutritionist thought was happening, and I guess two main examples there is one of them is around the monocal phosphate or dical phosphate or defluorinated phosphate or whatever the phosphorus source is. That in some, especially when we were using larger quantities of the phosphorus in the diet, that was being added to the mixer many times in a 8 or 9 inch auger, so you would have free fall of 6 to 8 pounds many times or higher on the monocal, and it was not a big deal when you were adding 50, 60 pounds of monocal or 40 pounds of monocal to a diet. But then when we go down to adding 5 or 6 pounds of monocal to a diet, or 2 pounds of monocal, it's not physically possible to do that in the mill. And trying to so all of a sudden we're having either, again, no monocal going in or a lot going in. And in calcium, it gives the other side of that equation. The calcium phosphorus ratio is very important when we're dealing with phytase. And we find out that calcium finds its way into diets a lot of different ways. And so, understanding what all additives are going into the diet, that sometimes the nutritionist doesn't even know what the veterinarian is adding or what somebody else is adding at the feed mill level that is adding calcium, because it's used as a carrier in so many different ingredients. And so having that understanding, and then just like I talked about the free fall, understanding that the free fall on the calcium carbonate bin is extremely important in terms of dealing with, especially with baby pig diets, that we just can't handle having excess calcium in those diets because of the negative effects it has on the pig. And that's something that we've had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, and I can give you another example, because I was thinking about that too. When you are assigning the ingredients in the microbeans too, I always like to put the most critical ingredients closer to the mixer. Like if you are weighing like phytase, phytase are becoming more concentrated, so we add less and less and less. So you don't want to put it like in the last microbean. You want to put it like in the one closer to the mixer, or if you are using medications too. That way, the ingredients that are behind can clean out the agar. Even the companies might be doing like some flushing and sequencing, but it just gives you like that extra insurance.
That's a very good point. I hadn't thought about that one, because a lot of times people want to put the highest inclusion rate ones close to the mixer, and it may be better to put them the furthest from the mixer.
Yeah. I feel like when you put in the most critical closer to the mixer, then you ensure that goes to the correct batch.
Yep. Well, that's a very good point. And I think that other side of that with the batching side is it helping. And I already talked about hand adds some, but that becomes so critical on trying to minimize and eliminate as many hand adds as possible. And that's an area I know integrated nutritionists. We've got a lot of our students that we've graduated out of here that are working for a lot of the larger production companies today, and they do a very good job of this, and I have sometimes learned from them in terms of how to put together packs and help the feed mill out with trying to minimize the number of things that can't go into the limited number of micro bins that they may have, or to put it in an overhead bin so that we don't have to do hand adds of large quantities of anything in that mill.
Yeah.
Well, the last one I had is as for my 5 lessons was around. This is kind of a big bucket for me, but as understanding ingredient procurement and then how samples are taken and retained at that mill, and then the paperwork requirements that they may be under, and the nutritionists really need to understand some of this, because we can again use it as our friend on understanding where samples may be available to us if we run into a problem, that we can go back and find out, is there an issue that happened? Either sometimes we find out that there's an issue in the barn, and we take a sample there, and sometimes that sample isn't taken very well. so we always want to go back and verify it with what sample that was taken at the feed mill. And because sometimes it can be that they got contaminated in the truck on the way to the farm. We've had a situation like that recently where the truck hauled out a supplement before they hauled our research feed, and we ended up with a very high ash content in our research feed, and it was just the samples from the mill kept telling us that there was nothing wrong until we looked through sequencing, and fortunately the feed mill was very good at working with us and understanding their sequencing of where their trucks were at, and we were able to track down why the diets came out the way that they did. And but those understanding some of this and again goes back to helping people understand the importance of flushing trucks and of when it's important, when it's not, and what we need to do from to help out everybody in the system. And and I think that the side that the swine world, we've been focusing a lot more in recent years on the feed safety side and the concerns about introducing viruses and in particular and bacteria, but more viruses than bacteria recently into the diet and into the barn through the feed mill, and so helping for me, that's been an area that the nutritionists have played an important role in interacting with the veterinarians because even though we're not in the mill every day, we know what's going on in the mill more than the veterinarians do many times. And so helping them understand what's doable and what's not doable before we go down and sit down with the feed mill, because sometimes for the feed mill people, they feel like they're being attacked by the production side, and we don't want that situation because sometimes your situation is what you inherited or you built as a company, and sometimes you can't change where the driveway is located, or you can't change that you're dumping ingredients into the same driveway as you're taking finished feed out of, and that as you're building new mills, you want to think about all those things. But sometimes on an existing mill, it's not as easy to request a change as what the veterinarian or the nutritionist may think it is.
Yeah, and you bring like a really good point, and also you spoke about this at the beginning of our conversation is communications, right? Issues, I don't think that a company is gonna run perfect all the time. There are always something is gonna happen, and the idea is not to find somebody to blame, right? It's to work as a team to avoid that problem in the future.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you want both sides, the pig owner and if these are two different companies, example, the pig owner and the feed mill owner, to understand and to have a long-term thought process that we don't want to, like you said, assign blame. We're trying to get to the bottom of the issue and try to prevent it from happening the next time is really the core of it. When you're in an integrated system, that sometimes is easier to do. Sometimes maybe sometimes it's not, but sometimes I think it's easier because you are on the same team, and it's clearer that the finances are all through the same company, and so incentives on one side, we need to think about how that impacts the other side, and it's even whether you're integrated or not, we need to be profitable through the whole production system in order to have everybody have their job and to keep the feed mill running and to keep the production system going. And so we have to figure out ways to work together. And
yeah, and even I see, like, if you have like a commercial feed mill, right, and the producer who is buying that feed is doing well and continue growing, then your business continues growing.
Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's the last piece of this part about the the sampling and the paperwork side and stuff is I think a lot of producers in particular don't understand just how stringent some of the paperwork is in feed mills, and particularly around antibiotic usage and so I think that's an area that whenever I try to get into a mill with a pig producer or somebody from that's out on the production side and getting them in the mill, is I want to make sure that they see what has to happen in the mill around antibiotic usage, and so that they can get a good understanding of, especially if we ask the mill to add another antibiotic, or we ask them to change something majorly, is what that does to their day, and if we have a mill that's antibiotic free, how much that also benefits the mill in terms of compared to a mill that's got making a lot of antibiotic feed.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a big challenge for like the toll millings that you were describing, because they use so many different ingredients, right? They get like probably they might get like 4 different phosphate sources,
yes,
limestone sources, zinc,
yes,
selenium, etc. So they as you're mentioning, as we simplify, like make their work easier, we reduce the likelihood of making mistakes at the feed mill.
Yep. I was in a smaller feed mill in Minnesota that was making feed for a lot of different production systems, and I went through their ingredient area. They had 5 different phytase sources in that mill, and we have at least 3 of those companies that they work with. We're auditing them for the age of the phytase and wanted to make sure that it wasn't getting old. And it's like, well, it's impossible not to get it old when you've got 5 phytase sources trying to manage inventory on. And so things like that, or everybody's got their own vitamin trace mineral premix, and so it's one of those things that we keep trying to work with some of these production systems, especially that are close together. Some of them, I tell them, you guys were trained at the same place. You believe in the same things. The premixes are almost identical. Can't we just use one premix for both these production systems?
Yes.
Examples.
Yeah.
It's time for our famous 3.
But yeah, well, we're getting, close to the end, Dr. Tokach. And before we finish, I would like just to ask you, like a couple of general questions. The first would be, what is your favorite feed mill related book or resource?
Well, I know that a lot of your listeners and a lot of people you're going to have on here will talk about the feed technology books, and I certainly use those quite often and refer to them when I have in-depth questions. But I would steer your audience to the Feed Science Research and Extension website that KSU Grain Science and Chad Polk helped put together with Charles Stark here at K-State. A lot of very nice fact sheets, and Kara Dunmeyer was the PhD student that helped build that, and there's a lot of good resources there that help answer a lot of the questions, and I think it's a great resource. And you can just, if you Google the Feed Science Research and Extension, it shows up as one of the first links.
Excellent. And hopefully some grad students out there are going to be listening to this podcast too. What will be your advice for them? How can they get prepared better to be more successful, regardless of what they do? Some of them are going to be working in nutrition, allied industry, feed mill. What will be your advice for them?
Well, I think take advantage of every opportunity you can. I mean, and that one's easier said than done too sometimes, because you're this grad student, you feel like you're overwhelmed and busy all the time and have too many things on your plate. But when you have opportunities to get into a feed mill, to take it, or if you have an opportunity, if you're a nutrition student, you definitely want to get into mills as often as you can with somebody that knows what they're doing, walking through mills to try to help educate you. The other side, if you're in the feed processing side, take an opportunity to get into production, into poultry or into swine production facilities, and understand how their bins are laid out and how some of the things that become the headaches there and stuff. And the same comes to coursework. If we're very fortunate, like I said, here at Kansas State, that we have the opportunity for our students to take some feed processing courses, and so we encourage all of our graduate students to take at least 1 or 2 of those courses as a start to open their eyes a little bit about the feed processing side, because not all of their colleagues at other universities have that opportunity. And so fortunately, there's getting to be a few more feed programs around the country, which is nice to see, because I think that's one of the ways we open the communication, is we get people to understand what's going on in the other side's industry.
Yeah, and I even feel like the industry are not seeing the feed mill more like as a cost center. Like when I came, to the industry 15 to 20 years, it was not a lot of investments in feed mill, and I see more companies investing in new mills or just upgrading the mills that they built like 15, 20 years ago, which is really good.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tokach. It has been a pleasure to spend, 40 minutes with you. I learned a lot today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.